Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication and with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. The passage from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians says, do not be anxious for anything. Is this something that we should be taking literal? Do not be anxious for anything? Another translation says, be anxious for nothing. Now, how is that possible? Because someone wonders, actually, is it even advisable? After all, things go wrong in a fallen world, and we just can't leave things to chance. And if you're going to be planning for things that are beyond your control, it's going to produce some anxiety. Well, true, we don't want to leave things to chance, and planning is advisable. But how about, in light of that, leaving things to providence? The simple truth is this: anxiety is not from God. If you feel the slightest tinge of anxiety about anything, that's not from God. It's like this. If you're moving forward in your call as a Christian to build God's kingdom in your own heart, in your family, and in your workplace, wherever you'll be, if you have anxiety, the result is that you're driving as if you had a car with a wobbly wheel, or steering that is unpredictable, and an engine that will wear out long before it's supposed to. And of course, God does not want this for you, which is why anxiety is never from Him. And so we have a remedy for this, which is very simple in this one verse from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. He says, yes, do not be anxious about anything. Instead, he says, in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. It's as simple as that. Okay, so we know that we should be praying for things. And so we have prayer. We've already entered into prayer today. Supplication refers to more specific prayers. Make specific requests for your needs. With thanksgiving, it says, make your requests known to God. But thanksgiving, of course, is included in that passage, and that's a given, right? If you're a Christian, you're a thankful person. I expect that if I asked everyone here, are you a thankful person? Everyone would say yes. We have our Thanksgiving holiday coming around in how soon? About 6 weeks. It'll be here before we know it. And we're all going to give thanks. But the question is, though, do you give thanks or do you have gratitude? Do you live a life of gratitude? There is a difference. And it's that deep gratitude that Paul is referring to here. The simple idea is that the more we're thankful for what God has done in the past, the more you'll expect God to do things in the future. It gives power to your prayers, and it gets rid of anxiety. Now, the enemy does not want this. That's why he wants you to be anxious, and he'll always bring thoughts to your mind about how things will go wrong, about how you're not in control. And anxiety takes your mind off of God. It takes your mind off of His providence. And so the simple fact of human nature is that as we begin every single day, what can go wrong, what we don't have, tends to obscure what we do have, much like an eclipse obscures the sun. But of course, the moon is much smaller than the sun. It seems to eclipse the sun. Just likewise, what we do have, the abundance that we have is much greater than any darkness that might obscure it. The enemy does not want you to recognize this. But in order to live a life without anxiety, in order to live a life of power in Christ, we need to be intentional about being thankful, which is like walking uphill, intentionally stirring up thanksgiving, reminding yourself of what you can be thankful for, reminding yourself of God's providence. And it does take effort, but it's like this. Remember that analogy I mentioned a moment ago about the car. Yes, it's work to maintain a car so you don't get the wobbly wheel, etc. It's an effort to go and make the appointment and to make that car maintenance happen, change the oil. But for a car to break down is much more effort. And so you put the effort in to be thankful, and the aggregate gain is having more energy. You don't have that anxiety, which saps your spiritual life out of you. And so here we're in the midst of this series. We have one more next week, 4-part series looking at St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. And I've titled this, In Him Who Strengthens Me. And so the letter, there's many ways in which we can look at St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, but one of the main themes here is thanksgiving, God's provision, His strength. And so he begins the letter by saying, the good work that God began in you, He will see through to completion. He's the one who will do it. And so at the end of the letter, we see that I can do all things, Paul says, through Christ who strengthens me. Thanksgiving has this effect. To be aware of the way Christ has strengthened you in the past, the way He's strengthening you now, and the way He will continue to strengthen you in the future. This is the dynamic of power in the Christian life. And so, if we are aware of this in the past, we'll know of the power in the future. So, in order to get into this habit, it's helpful in the morning just to say 3 things you're thankful for. Now, it's very easy, though, to get into, if you make this a simple habit, to just give thanks. Give thanks rather than have gratitude. I'm thankful for my spouse, my health, the fact that I've got a roof over my head. This is not entering into Thanksgiving. But if you consider this, someone gave me a card some time ago. I didn't even know who the author was of this. But one time I decided to read these words and own them. And this goes deeper than just giving thanks. These words like these can help you to enter into gratitude. I celebrate the present abundance of my life. Now, how often do you do that? I celebrate the present abundance of my life. I enumerate and enjoy the many blessings which I do have and those I see now entering my life. Yes, you see problems down the road, but do you enumerate and take time to enjoy those blessings that are entering your life? And then finally, I allow myself to count over the many dreams I have which have come true. That's not taking for granted the fact that you have already had dreams come true. Now, I'm not aware that this is coming even from a Christian source, but you do this in light of what you have in the gospel, and how much more power do you have? I came across, this is just last night, just as thought came into my mind, what's the research regarding Thanksgiving and how it deals with anxiety? And sure enough, there are many studies which shows just this. I mean, Paul is ahead of his time. He's ahead of the social science. Actually, I copied some of the words. I'll save you from the psychological and psychotherapy jargon. But suffice it to say, government studies have proved Paul's words to be true. And that's in a secular context. How much more when we embrace all that we have through the riches of the gospel? So I want to look at this in 2 different levels. One, in light of God's providence in all things, and then finally, in light of our worship. But first, in light of God's providence in all things, let's consider Romans 8:28. We know, Paul says, that in everything God works for good with those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. In everything. That means that we can give thanks for things even when they go wrong, knowing that God has the good of your soul in mind. So even when things go wrong, we don't give thanks in spite of those circumstances. We give thanks in light of those circumstances. That's your privilege in Christ. Consider these words from the psalmist. I came across these this past week, both in my daily office readings and during a daily mass. From Psalm 119. Before I was afflicted, he said, I went astray. But now I keep your word. It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. So here the psalmist gives thanks for affliction because it resulted in him pressing more into God, which is greater blessing than any ease of the world could ever give. Do you believe that? Do you believe that this morning? Will you believe that tomorrow morning? Let me just give you a brief example from my life. When I was in college, as a freshman, I learned of an award that would be given to an upperclassman, a small group of upperclassmen who distinguished themselves on campus. And I thought, boy, wouldn't it be nice to get an award like that? I didn't realize quite how much I was gearing my extracurricular involvement, my activities, my interactions with others with this mind that it might get me that award. And in fact, some other people were saying, don't worry, I know you're going to get this. And I wanted to say, oh, how can you know that? But I couldn't help but think, maybe. But I didn't. And I never would have expected how disappointed I would have been. Let's just say, I could go into more details, quite disappointed. But let me say this. This is one of those circumstances that opened my heart up to receive the gospel. I mean, I was basically an agnostic at that time, but it caused me to ask the question, gee, I put so much effort into this worldly award. What else could I be working to that has more value, that can't be taken away, that is just so unpredictable like this? And so it was only not even 6 months later that I finally received the gospel. And I looked back and I said, thank God I didn't receive that award. Otherwise, I probably would have been working towards the next award, the next worldly accolade. But this caused me, it was just one of those things that moved me to find something deeper. So again, we give thanks not in spite of our afflictions, but in light of them. Or think of Joseph of the Old Testament. He had this vision that ultimately his brothers would bow down to him, and he recounted this vision to him. He wanted this because God put that desire in his heart, but he didn't have much humility, did he? So the only way ultimately for this to take place was for him to experience affliction. His brothers sold him into slavery. He wound up in the dungeon twice, in fact. But this was the only way for this ultimately to take place, and we know the famous words that in the final disclosure, Joseph says to his brothers, what you meant it to me for evil, but the Lord meant it to me for good. This is essentially the Old Testament way of expressing Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to those who love God and are called to his purpose. So if you look back at your life, guaranteed, you'll see things that were grievous to you at the time, mistakes you made, you went off track, or opportunities that you hoped to receive but didn't get. And you can look back and say, thank God for that. If that didn't happen, then I wouldn't have met my wife, or I wouldn't have found this job, or you fill in the blanks. So this is the thanks that we can give in light of God's providence. But before we close, we would be remiss not to consider how much thanks we can give in light of God's worship. Because what are we here for? We're here for the Eucharist. In the Greek, Eucharistia, which means thanksgiving. And so it is. We come and we've already given thanks in the beginning of the Mass. Already we sang a song of thanksgiving together as part of our liturgy. But did you give thanks, or did you enter into gratitude? We'll have another opportunity coming up in the preface of the Mass. And this preface, however, is something that is often skipped over when it comes to liturgical theology. And this is what the great liturgical theologian Alexander Schmemann pointed out. He said that we so often, when we get into the study of the liturgy, we get into the Eucharist and what happens with the words of institution. Exactly at what point does it become Jesus' body and blood, and how do we understand that? But we often overlook what happens before the consecration, the preface, where we give thanks. A preface in a book is often something that you skip over. That's not the meat of the book. But this preface of thanksgiving when we say, "It is meet and right to give thanks," to respond. This is where, at this moment of thanksgiving, this is where the roof is blown open. This is where you enter into heaven, spiritually speaking. And it's in light of this that we become not just aware of the gift of our redemption. You are literally spiritually in heaven with the angels outside of time. And so the Eucharist, at this point, you enter into the life of paradise. And the only full and real response to this, of our creation, our redemption, and the gift of heaven, is gratitude, deep gratitude. And so we can come at this and say, is this the remedy for anxiety? Is this what's going to fill my lack? Well, yes, but let's go a step further. Schmemann says, ultimately, this thanksgiving comes out of fullness, recognizing that you are filled and holding on to that joy. He said, this movement of thanksgiving is what makes possible all that follows in the Eucharist. And this is where we have a new state of being, a new style of life, which is Eucharist. And it's from this Eucharist that we are sent out of these doors, and we bring this with us into all that we do. It gives us new perspective to understand our world, a new lens in which to see all of creation in light of our redemption. And so what do these eyes look like? Now, just one more example from my life, and the question is, when things go really wrong, can you still give thanks? And to some of you, the question may come to mind. How is Father dealing with this in light of his recent circumstances? Just 2 months now since the death of my son. And let me share with you the words that I received from Monk Ermaios, someone with whom I'm in correspondence. And he wrote to me, he said, "I pray that the last few days have been not of pain, but of understanding and blessing with the help of Christ." Now he continues, "Now these may seem like crazy words for me to write you at such a time." But then parenthetically he explains this. He says, he's in Mount Athos. He says, "In Athos, we all say often, don't think about this logically, but theologically." And he says, now, if you know exactly what those words really mean, but you may know, the word theology means God plus logos, word. And in this context, we understand it to mean the logic of God, theologic. And so with human logic, we can never truly understand anything, spiritual anyway. But with God's logic, and this is where he continues. He says, with God's logic, even tragedies such as these turn into times of joy, thanksgiving, and blessings in Christ. And then he just adds, that I'm sure you know, it's why our martyrs so joyfully endured those horrifying tortures, as if another person's body was being tortured and not their own. So yes, I do feel the torture of sorts. The grief is real. But let me tell you this, while I was on retreat this past week, I picked up this card, and I read these words. I celebrate the present abundance of my life. And I enumerate and enjoy the many blessings which I do have, and those I see now entering my life. And let me tell you, I was able to give thanks not in spite of these circumstances, but yes, in light of these circumstances. Because with theologic, we do have dreams that have come true. You have been made new in Christ. Your life is hidden with God. You have been redeemed. And this redemption in which we experience outside of time at the Eucharist, God cares that it still is part of your life no matter what happens when you go out of these doors. Because he cares about your soul, to continue to nurture your soul in all things, that he will work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And this is why in our ordinary liturgy, the blessing at the end of the Mass is with the words that conclude today's reading from this passage, which are, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So as we enter into the liturgy further today, yes, let us not just give thanks, but enter into gratitude so that we can have that peace of God which surpasses all understanding, even according to theologic. Let us bring that gratitude into the world. Also, we go forward as we heard today in Thanksgiving which makes anxiety melt away. And so we just gave thanks for the fact that the cross has become an occasion of our thanksgiving. And if that's the case, then certainly everything can be transformed in our lives by our God's providence. Be anxious for nothing, Paul says, and let us go forward with a peace that only he can give.